each person to a table near them.
We see the work that we're doing right now very much as like, we're creating this platform for these amazing, brave, creative people who like live through some shit and are ready to like talk about it and build friendships from that place of heartbrokenness, but create something beautiful from it. And our job now is to like get out of the way and give them the platform to be able to tell their story.
The dinner party is not about one-off dinners. These tables of just 10 to 15 people meet every couple of months so the attendees can build meaningful connection over time. Kevo, what stuck out with you about our conversation with Carla and Lennon?
Lennon took one of my phrases and remixed it into something I love, which is find your elephant. We were talking about sort of the early days of the dinner party. And, you know, they created this dinner party, both of the founders having lost a loved one. And they created these dinner parties as a space to speak about this thing that they felt isolated about, that they didn't have the space to speak about. They called it elephant in the room. And
yeah, they definitely like talk about intentionally censoring themselves around people basically all throughout their daily lives.
Yeah. And feeling like there are just so many landmines with, if someone asked me about, you know, what do my parents do? You know, as experiencing loss, I would ruin the conversation. I would ruin someone's day because I was sharing about my life.
Yeah.
And they created this space to talk about it. They created this community to discuss this idea of, you know, life after loss. I get to talk to community leaders or aspiring ones that, you know, have a hunch they want to start something. I think this is a really powerful point. You know, what makes a really compelling community? It's about finding that elephant. It's about, you know, what is it that people are bursting to talk about or share with each other or experience with each other, but that they don't have the space to. And can you get people together and create that environment? You know, Carla and Lennon have taken it one step further, and I think they've really designed the community after that first dinner to drive home that purpose. They're not chasing just like growth at all costs. They're not letting anybody host a table. That they really are thinking about this. You know, what does it mean for someone to transform life after loss and have these ongoing discussions of support and candid conversation? And how do we continue to make decisions, you know, for this organization, for this community, with this community in mind? Every step of the way that continues to realize, you know, their community's purpose.
Yeah. Sweet. Let's jump in. Carla, Lennon, talk to us.
I'm Lennon, and I'm a co-founder of the dinner party and the executive director.
I am Carla Fernandez. I am the co-founder of the dinner party with Lennon.
Can you guys take us back 8 or 9 years ago and tell us about what motivated you to start the dinner party?
Lennon and I met just over 9 years ago, and we met in the months following my dad dying of brain cancer. I was 20 years old when he got diagnosed and was 21 when he passed away, and I was one of the main caretakers for him during that time. And I found myself at a moment where most of my friends were getting their first jobs out of college and going backpacking and doing the things that 20 and 21-year-olds generally do. I found myself in a very different reality, caring for someone who was dying. And then when I came out of that experience, I was looking for connection and people who understood what that was like, but really didn't know anyone else my age who'd experienced that kind of a loss, and had gone to the traditional grief support group, but it was in the basement of the hospital where my dad had gotten his radiation, and it was literally the last place I wanted to hang out. I saw a therapist who was amazing, but it was kind of a monologue, and I was sort of having this Goldilocks feeling of like, where is the piece of the puzzle that's about hanging out with people who feel like friends, where we can open up a bottle of wine and talk about this, not in a sterile, institutional, medical way, but in a way that just feels like human. And then I luckily met Lennon not long after, and it took us a couple months into our friendship before we sort of admitted to one another that we both lost a parent to cancer. We were coworkers at a startup and had both gotten really good at like avoiding the subject because it generally was a conversation stopper, conversation killer, if you will. But when I met Lennon, I realized that I found a friend who I actually could have that conversation with. So I invited her over to dinner to talk about it, and invited a few other people who I'd also been collecting early 20-somethings who'd lost a parent. Yeah, I invited them over, and it felt like a social experiment and very well could have been the most awkward blind date of all of our lives. And it was actually really the opposite. And we had this amazing night where we could talk about the parts of our stories relating to grief that sucked and were hard, but also the parts that were like weirdly hysterical and complicated. And we could talk about dating after loss and shifting relationships with other family members after loss, really what life looked like after, and how do you move on from something like this, and how do you be a young person without that source of support in your life. So at the end of that night, the intention was like, let's do this once and see how it goes. And by the time we kind of got to dessert, there was a shared understanding that this was something really powerful and that we wanted to sit down again.
Did you think about any kind of facilitation of that first dinner?
So I had printed out some prompts that I had on people's plates that I have somewhere in a drawer or like a storage unit. I could dig them up at some point for our archive purposes. But that doesn't really do it. You know, people aren't gonna, a great conversation doesn't get kicked off just because there's like a poem sitting on your plate. And frankly, the beginning of the night was like a little bit tense and a little bit awkward. I think everyone arrived and there was this real elephant in the room of like, when are we actually gonna talk about this thing that we know we're all here to talk about? And people are really good about like talking about the weather and what they're watching on TV and how this was in Los Angeles, like how bad the traffic was coming over. And it wasn't until we sat down to dinner and I toasted to my dad and we all kind of raised our glasses and I invited people to introduce us to whoever it was that brought them to the table. That's when we could all kind of drop in and go there. And I think a lot of our work since then has been figuring out, when Lennon and I aren't in the room, what are the facilitation, in air quotes, since people are listening, techniques that we can give to our hosts that don't feel like you're in an overly facilitated space, that still feels like you're hanging out with friends, and yet I'll make sure that like we talk about the thing we're here to talk about before dessert is served.
Lennon, I want to ask you too, just to share your personal background and experience. You're now, the executive director of this thing that I'm sure you didn't see coming, walking into that first dinner party. So what made you feel like it was such a special experience?
So as Carla mentioned, my mom died while I was in college, and she had been sick for about 4 years. And I think as a result of that, between the ages of 17 and 21, I got extremely well practiced in the art of compartmentalizing, and making sure you never had to go there. And my family background was complicated before my mom got sick and remained much more so after her passing. And that kind of tendency of just never ever talking about it stayed with me long after she died. I had just moved out to Los Angeles around the same time that Carla did, in a few months before that first dinner. And I realized that, I had been coming from DC, which was like a bigger version of Chapel Hill, the school where I'd gone to college, and no longer had anybody in my life who was familiar with, some of the details, and the big headlines, without my having to mention it or tell anyone. And I found that kind of fear and terror of like, as you're a new person in a new city, trying to do what every new person does is make friends. And there were all of these like perceived landmines in my own life of like, please don't ask anything about where I come from or what your parents do or, like what's on your mind right now, because it was complicated, right? So it was, that first conversation with Carla that I still remember as we were walking back from coffee to the office. I remember her mentioning that her father had passed away, and that being one of the first moments. It wasn't the first moment that I had acknowledged that my mom died, but it was the first moment that I wanted to talk about it, and felt for the first time that I had somebody to talk about it with. But it wasn't, something that we could kind of carry on in front of the office water cooler. So when Carla sent that email, I met it with both anxiety and also real excitement, not having done this before, not knowing how it would go. I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I remember like distinctly walking up to this dodgy house that Carla, this group house that Carla shared that we,
dodgy, called you out.
Super dodgy.
LA house.
The Blue Mansion. And I remember like walking up the hill from my car and knocking on the door. And as Carla mentioned, those first couple of moments that, were a little bit awkward, but there was something nice in having, like being put immediately on stirring the paella and helping to set the table, that there were things that we could do with our hands. And in the course of that conversation, I honestly don't remember what it was that we talked about other than parents in our lives. What I do remember was that the conversation went until about 1 a.m. and we all crawled up into Carla's bedroom in that dodgy house and fell asleep side by side like little puppies, and then obviously wanted to do it again when it was a long time later before we kind of realized that not only was this, an experience that had been meaningful for us around a table, but that we were actually not at all alone in that story. And that there were even people that I knew who'd experienced a major loss. It was just that none of us knew that the other was there because we were all so good at avoidance. And we were all so good at fearing the presence of that elephant in a room. I wish that there was a single kind of lightning bolt moment, in which we could point to like, oh, yep, this is going to be like our life's mission and calling, and let's go, launch this as an organization. There wasn't. There was a long, years worth of conversations and, oh, isn't this interesting? And, oh, what we're doing isn't rocket science. And yet, why was it so hard and rare to find this particular community?
There's this sociologist, which maybe you guys know, I think his name is Erving Goffman, and he talks about how in life we're always sort of putting on performances. We're like standing on stages all the time, and the loved people in your life are the people that you talk backstage with, and you talk like about the performance with those people. And I feel like hearing you guys talk about the experience of having to sort of like smile and sort of perform for other people, you found people that you could go backstage with in a way. I wanted to ask you how you approach going from one dinner party, you guys are laying in bed together like puppies, know you want to do this again, to maybe just like the first next table. How did you guys get from we're doing this to like we're going to enable other people to do this? Can you kind of take us through that realization and why you decided to do that and how you got the first one off the ground?
So while this initial table was gathering, I was in conversation with my therapist who lived in San Francisco, who's awesome, and I highly recommend. Hit me up for details. And she started asking me, basically she was like, I have about 5 or 6 other clients who come and sit in my office every week, oftentimes pass each other in the hallway, in and out of my office, who've all lost someone in their life and are asking for this kind of space. Can I just introduce you to them? And was like, okay, sure. And ended up coming up to the Bay and having coffee with a handful of different people and realized that like the initial group in Los Angeles, like Lennon was saying, oddly enough, we weren't the only 5 weirdos on the planet that wanted this kind of space, and other people were verbalizing it and asking for it. So we worked together with some of those folks that we connected with to start our first table in the Bay. And that's where a lot of the kind of understanding of what is this thing and how do you train someone to host one of these and what are the qualities that we look for in someone who could become a host.
And it was around the same time that I was going back actually to the nonprofit that I've been working with in DC and going back and forth between LA and DC, and shared with a colleague there what we were doing in LA. And he then shared that his father had died a few years before. And that was the first conversation that we'd had about it. A friend of his from grad school had lost her twin brother to suicide. And there were a number of other kind of 1-degree associations. People were like, oh, I think this would be really valuable for myself or somebody that, is really important to me. And so we started doing dinners in DC. And, I was back and forth a lot, so we could do it anytime I happened to be there. And then it didn't take long to realize that that was really dumb because, again, this wasn't rocket science. I didn't have to be in the room to carry on each of those conversations and to be that kind of bottleneck. So then the idea of a table as an entity, began to form. And it continued that way for a couple of years. We started tables in Baltimore and in New York. And when Carla and I happened to be there for, work or personal travel, we would host a table. And when we weren't there, they could get together on their own. And that was beginning to put language to, okay, so what is it that we're doing, right? What are some of the things that work and what are some of the things that don't? I was guilty of dinner parties that start 2 hours late, both because I was frantically trying to do everything myself and I'm constantly running on California time. We would let the conversations linger and the weather and the traffic and entertainment or whatever it is you talk about in LA. Until, one of the early dinner partiers in LA was like, hey guys, are we ever going to talk about death and grief? And I was like, oh, right. Okay. So lesson 1, somebody actually has to kick off a conversation. Pseudo by accident around that very first table when Carla raised her glass to her father, that the kind of moment of cheersing became kind of a real moment of liftoff in a conversation. I think early on we kind of thought of this as like punk rock grief support and then realized pretty quickly, no, actually it's not that, right? It is friendship formation. and community formation that exist alongside that in a space where we're not seeking counseling because, we've got therapists, right? You're seeking a space in which you don't actually have to hide any part of your story. And you can see the head nods and the moments of surprise in all of the differences across our stories and be witness to those as well.
What strikes me is that phrase you said earlier, the elephant in the room. We get to talk to some people who sort of have this hunch that they want to start a community. Maybe there's a particular group of people that they care about, or there's just sort of a feeling around a particular issue. And I think as far as what makes great ingredients to start a community, this idea of the elephant in the room, like what is it that people are at times like bursting to speak about that they may not have the space to take that courageous first step to do something together and create that space. It has the possibility to really realize a purpose for many people. I do think that there's something about that potential in, that elephant in the room. And if someone can recognize it and see, yeah, what if I got people together to address that? Thank you for taking that first step, bringing those people together that first time.
The answer here is find your own elephant. And all of us have one, right? The number of experiences that we carry alone, only to discover actually you're not alone in holding that, right? Present day, the power of the words me too, right? In order to have that conversation that a lot of people are longing to have, somebody has to take that daring first step of naming their own story, and again, in the kind of art of hosting a dinner party isn't being an expert in grief or anybody else's story. It is having the capacity to share your own vulnerability, right? Which gives people self-permission to share theirs. And there's something that's powerful about diffusing as opposed to we're all going to sit down and have a really hard conversation, the metaphor of an elephant in the room, right? There's something that is actually longing to be said here. Let's go ahead and say it.
Can you guys talk a little bit about what hosts do to do that, to diffuse the energy in some ways, to start the conversation? You've already hit on the importance of someone making the transitional moment in the conversation. You've talked about cheersing, but what are some of the things that you talk to your hosts of tables about to make sure that the conversation does get there and people do kind of feel like they have permission to speak right to the thing that they came to dinner for?
We've been developing sort of tips and tricks in a guidebook that we share with our hosts. They include things that we stumbled upon accidentally, like it's actually a great idea to have some things left unfinished so that as people arrive, there are tasks to be done and ways to busy your hands so that someone who might be feeling jitters to be not only entering a stranger's home for the first time, but also preparing to have a conversation they maybe have never been able to put words around before. There's something for them to do.
Like fidget almost.
Like set the table, light the candles, open a bottle of wine, finish making the salad, something to get their hands going, which we discovered after many nights of, as Lennon said, running late. And then we're like, oh, this is serving a purpose right now.
Strategic lateness.
Strategic lateness, precisely. And then when the host starts each conversation, there's a set of guidelines that we ask them to run through. If it's the first time the table's meeting, we have everyone around the table sort of introduce themselves, introduce who brought them to the table. And then we always ask the question, where are you at with your loss right now? I think oftentimes people can just sort of default into the autoplay the story they've already told 10 times about the accident or the diagnosis or the funeral. What we really want people to do is get into the present tense and talk about what happened at work this week or how is this coming up in your relationship, knowing that grief is a lens through which so much of our life is seen, whether it happened a year ago, a month ago, or 10 years ago. So we really try to get people talking in the present tense. And then we also have the hosts run through some guidelines that include things like a Vegas rule. So what happens at the table stays at the table. Silence being heard just as much as speech for people who don't actually want to share anything at all. It's not as one of our advisors says, it's not a share or die environment, which I think a lot of these spaces that are we're here to have meaningful conversation. Everybody share the most vulnerable thing you've ever said out loud. That's so not what this is about. It's about people listening to their own boundaries and what they feel comfortable about and If they sit there and nod their head the whole time and don't say a word, awesome. And then the third, one of the other guidelines that we share is around no advice giving. This isn't a space for people to come and be like, oh, I know what you should do about your crazy stepmom. It worked for mine. It's about sort of listening people into their own truths. And oftentimes people do kind of share what's worked for them, but it's very much not a place where people are giving advice.
Another piece of the format that's less about each dinner and what happens within it, but more about the way you see the tables and the communities you're building that I love, is that you explicitly call out that these are not one-time events. These are groups meeting over and over and over again. Kevin and I just wrote this book and we spoke to hundreds of communities. And the biggest takeaway for me personally was like the importance of showing up and going to the same thing once a week, once a month. We're just in this like one-off culture, and relationships cannot build if you do not give them time to build. How come you guys came to know that was important, and how do you communicate that to anyone who's applying or hosting?
So part of that answer, lay in that very first table, right, out of which grew a really good group of friends. The relationships are the product of, affinity and time. We don't place any kind of architecture around it, or accountability and expectation of like, you will come to the next 6 dinners once per month for the next 6 months. And if not, you're out. If you miss one, done. But how do you create an environment that people want to show back up to? And one of the things that was really fascinating to me as we began to dig into what were some of the characteristics that marked our best tables, right? Our most active and engaged tables, where people were consistently sharing this had been a transformative experience. And it wasn't actually that the host happened to be our best facilitators. As somebody who's like a complete nerd in this space, wanted to have like all of the 6 guidelines and all of the how-tos and deep training and, X, Y, and Z. And that wasn't it at all. The hosts who were really good at making this consistent, for whom they didn't let, life get in the way, and all of us have been there and had that experience where, you wake up 6 months later after the really busy phase, right? And you're like, I haven't seen this person that I really meant to. The kind of investment in a community requires an investment. Let's not kid ourselves about that. So how do you create an environment? And in that case, right, if that's going to happen on a regular basis, then it can't be a drain for you as a host. But that consistency really, really matters, because at the end of the day, our end goal is helping to seed relationships and friendships. And that is only going to be the product of time.
I want to talk about how you guys sort of like vet and have people apply and how you review applications. I love how you make so clear how human the process is on your website. You say, please know that our staff, all of whom have experienced significant loss themselves, read every single host application with care and appreciate and honor the vulnerability it takes to fill out a form. You also explain, similarly to anyone who's applying to be at a table, that this is going to be a long application, that you will in fact read it. It may take time to respond. But I'm just so impressed by how you guys are not trying to optimize all of this for speed or growth. You're really orienting towards quality. And so can you just give us a few behind the curtain looks at how you think about finding the right people for attending a table?
One purported best practice, which I think is a really dumb myth, is that you have to lower the barrier so much for people to show up. And that lowering the barrier sometimes means don't ask them for anything that's going to take more than 14 seconds to think about in entering your name and your email address. And we hear all the time, actually, that the fact that our application is long is, one step of a long healing journey, right? Because oftentimes it's the first time that a person has been asked in a long time to describe what it is that brings them there, to talk about where it is that they are now, which isn't an answer that simply rolls off the tongue, because we need spaces in which to actually reflect and consider that. We ask questions of, how do you like to spend your Saturdays? Because part of, again, creating tables where people find their friends and their crew by connecting not only around shared experiences of loss, but also other shared interests, and we connect early 20-somethings to other early 20-somethings and late 30-somethings to late 30-somethings, because They've got other common milestones in their lives, and loss is an entry point, but not the end point. Questions around identity, whether that's your gender or sexuality or racial identity. In New York, we've got 80 odd tables that we're actively meeting on the regular. So we can be choosy in where we send somebody. If you are the only person of color at an otherwise all white table, right, you're not likely to go back, right? And in addition to that, it can be incredibly freeing to be in a space, with others who share other same identities. We have a number of affinity tables, that are either around shared experiences of loss, tables for folks who all experienced loss to a stigmatized cause. Tables for folks who've all lost a sibling, and then tables, for folks who share a particular identity, whether that's LGBT or POC. That's part of the reason that we, ask all of those what can feel like, to the outside, I think, annoying questions, but we actually don't ever get that feedback from people who are actually going through the process themselves.
I think as we've figured out, what is the actual model to enable this thing to grow, we've experimented with the, maybe there's a table in each city and first come, first serve. The first 15 people that RSVP for tonight's dinner get a seat. And what would happen was that people would come into that space, and because it was a different combination of folks every time, they had to reintroduce themselves. And the conversation never actually progressed past hi, my name is, this is who brought me to the table. This is the story that honestly can sometimes be re-traumatizing to share on repeat over and over and over again. And I think since the beginning, we've had so many people just be put your toolkit online and move on to the next issue area. And we've learned so much about how in a culture that's pushing for low barrier to entry, simple UX, make this very easy. Sure, but it wouldn't work. The thing that actually makes this work and that makes this transformative for people is the fact that we're reading applications, that we're hand matching people to tables, that we are, spending the time to not just have a cattle call for everybody to come to the one dinner that's happening tonight in LA, but we're creating these small groups of friends. And it's interesting as the community word merges or is being claimed or is entering more sort of tech spaces and corporate spaces and places where there's a bottom line and where there's certain metrics that people are measuring. And I feel like we're trying to stay strong in our ground of to build community where people actually have each other's backs, where conversation that's happening is actually meaningful, where spaces are actually life-changing. It doesn't fit one-to-one inside of structures where people are so focused on growth for growth's sake and efficiency and streamlining. And we're excited to just talk honestly about the amount of labor and time and care it takes to build something that has this level of impact in people's lives. It can't be shortcutted.
I think that transparency is also powerful for someone on the receiving end, right? To hear these people care about me enough to spend time to think about this. It adds intentionality, it adds texture, it adds weight to you joining, to you being placed in a certain spot, and to the intentionality of everyone who shows up at that house or at that table. So you set the tone for everyone when they know that that's happening, that you guys are being really thoughtful and reading about their lives. I think that's a very powerful act of generosity.
And we're working right now on a website that will change how all of this works, in that once people's applications are approved, they'll get to select which table they join based on their zip code and which hosts have availability. And we're excited because it's going to allow us to kind of step back from the matchmaking work, which takes a lot of time. And there's some big questions of is giving people within our community the agency to choose going to make them feel like they belong that much more? Or for people who are coming in who are in kind of an acute state of grief, there's decision paralysis, just put me to a table. So we're very much watching and learning how much can we help to navigate people who come in that would feel differently about that kind of a decision.
With my experience talking to folks who run chapter or circle-based organizations that have lots of little pods all over, one of the kind of beautiful things is to create the sandbox and learn from how people utilize it, how they experiment. And sometimes those lessons lead to quote unquote best practices, or sometimes they lead to, let's avoid that. So I'm curious for each of you, what is something that you learned or surprised you from other hosts, from other people organizing these tables?
I've definitely had experiences of attending dinners where I'm a participant and being odd by how our hosts handle certain delicate transitions in conversation or manage getting the table set in time for a dinner of 15 people and seem like totally relaxed about it. And it's been really beautiful to kind of like realize that there are masters within our community that are getting better at this than Lennon and I probably ever will be. Or I will be, speak for myself. One thing that we're seeing happen in some cities is hosts and partiers coming to us asking if they can create experiences that bring some of those affinity groups together. So we're now having dinner partiers get together in cities like DC and Austin for Shabbat dinners on Friday nights, connecting across tables for people that are looking for that kind of space. We're also seeing dinner partiers host their own like day-long retreats. One just happened in the Bay Area. We have some dinner partiers planning a drag show fundraiser for us next month in Chicago. Be There, Be Square. We see the work that we're doing right now very much as like we're creating this platform for these fucking amazing, brave, creative people who like live through some shit and are ready to like talk about it and build friendships from that place of heartbrokenness, but create something beautiful from it. And our job now is to like get out of the way and give them the platform to be able to like tell their story, recruit for more hosts in their cities and towns, help us fundraise to keep this thing going, help us improve like what kind of tools they need to be able to have good dinners. And yeah, right now our job is very much like keeping our ears wide open and learning from these hundreds of hosts around the country that are doing the thing.
As somebody who then, went on to think a lot about what are the guidelines and practices around facilitation that hold this, it became a surprise when I realized people that I would not have pointed to as master space holders, right? But whose enthusiasm and passion for a community, whose like authenticity and sincerity and desire to connect, right? And thoughtfulness, around texting somebody on an anniversary or a birthday because they're not just involved in their own lives. Those were some of the ingredients that made for our best tables. So we're constantly learning from our community. And I think we're still looking for like those platforms where we can do more peer sharing and idea sharing from across our community, because there's a gold mine of lessons. And for every awkward situation or hard thing, and when you are talking about hard things, it happens, right? That there isn't a single situation that has proven unsolvable because of the genius within our community and folks who've experienced it.
I think so many people who have started a group of people getting together regularly need to think about at some point is how to sustain the organization and how money shows up in the picture. So you guys have a $35 annual fee, but I wanted to ask you about how you made that decision to start charging an annual fee and how you approached communicating that with your existing community.
Lennon and I arm wrestled about this for probably 8 of the 9 years we've known each other. And for good reason. There's a lot of people working in the end of life grief space that are selling a product that can sometimes feel like they're taking advantage of a person in a time of need. And we have always been very, very careful to not fall into that camp. And we've never wanted to charge for what we do. But then these amazing things would happen, like we get press that our childhood selves wouldn't even dream of getting, like being in Oprah magazine and being on NPR, and we'd wake up the next morning, the kind of morning where we should be like celebrating with like a mimosa brunch because yay, life goals, but actually we would freak the fuck out because we'd have hundreds, if not thousands of applications in our inbox, and we didn't have any additional funds to actually respond, as we've been saying, read every single one of those applications and hand match every single one of those people. So it meant that we've had this sort of backlog of applications almost since the day that we've started. We finally came to a point where we're like, okay, we need to figure out how, as our community grows and as demand for our community grows, so do the resources to be able to hire people to actually take care of different regions across the country. And I think the amount was conversations with our team, conversations with our community, surveying people in our community, asking like, what do you think? How much should this be? I think $35 for some people seems like, it's 2 months of Netflix, or it's one copay for one therapy appointment, and I'm getting to come to dinners for the rest of the year. But that felt like the right amount for us. And like you said, we have plenty of ways where people can get a scholarship or not pay. Then no one gets turned away from any of our tables. Lennon, you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, no, as the person that lost the arm wrestling match after, 8 years, I stand corrected, right? And, I was really wary of having a membership fee. First of all, because, every member of our community has paid their dues on entry. And the idea that, if our end goal is creating real community, and circles of friends, that isn't a thing you buy and pay for, right? It's not a product in the grocery aisle, And it didn't change the reality that it actually costs something for us to do this. One of the things that we found, over the last few years is just that, for us to do our jobs, right, we need more hands and more time in which to do it. Right. And we know the consequences of not having that staff there, when people fall through the cracks. And at the end of the day, we were less willing to let people fall through the cracks than we were, to take the risk on, including a membership fee. It's also true that this entire community, that $35 alone, is as a number that is what our community said they could pay, isn't enough to sustain the thing. And so we've been reliant from day one on donations. And part of the advantage of this having been a community in a few cities, before it was ever an organization, was that from the very beginning, we had people who were passionate about it and champions, and who went out, and on our very first crowdfunding campaign that allowed me to quit my job, and for us to have enough resources to do a few events in year one. All of those donations came from members of our community and people who love them. We've got a $400,000 budget now and a staff, and a team, and it takes resources to run this. I think one of our passion points is around demystifying both where the money goes and, breaking the myth, that communities build themselves, right? They need support.
From an outside perception point of view, people sometimes look at our work and they're like, what do you need money for? They're potluck dinners in people's homes by volunteers. If people had the ability or the confidence or the tools to find others who are grieving and sit down to dinner, they would have already done it by now. What we're learning is that there does need to be this hub, this brand, for lack of the better word, this platform out in the world that's inviting people into this kind of conversation, inviting people into a different way of thinking about their grief and relating to it, and not just sweeping it under the rug. So we see a big part of our work is not just the matchmaking and the table curation, but also kind of banging the gong or putting up the bat signal or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
Whatever corny metaphor you want to use, that there is another way of living your life after you lose someone that means a lot to you. And all of that work takes time and partnership and crafting. We've heard from people that they've just read our manifesto, or they've been matched to a table and they probably won't ever attend, and they're kind of lurking on the wait list. We call them lurkers. Mm-hmm. But just knowing that this thing exists, gives them some kind of solace, gives them some kind of ease. So we're interested in whether someone comes to a dinner every month for the next 10 years of their life, or just gets matched to a table and knows that they have this safety net if they need it. We're very stoked to meet people where they're at and have spaces in our community for people who are looking for all different kinds of levels of connection and support.
We always say communities, you build them with others, not for them. And there's something about the knowledge that you guys are all passing around how to transition into these hard conversations, how to connect people who have such a pain point, but also a connection point. There's also a piece of you guys just by being a network that allows you to push forward the kinds of conversations people are able to have about grief by sharing insights and learnings and the little sort of fingertip feeling things that happen that really do make all the difference in this kind of situation. I want to close by just asking you guys, we have people listening out there, maybe not as many people as NPR, but there are people out here listening. If we gave you a magic wand, what would you ask for the dinner party? It could be something tangible or intangible, but what is the big wish you had for your community?
So I guess, my first magic wand is money. We'll take it. And we do really good things with it, we promise. I think the other piece, though, and Carla and I knew this from the very beginning, we will never be able to serve every single grieving human, because at some point in our lives, that is every single human. And the number of people who lose someone long before they should vastly exceeds the number of people that can ever be served by one organization. So our interest is really, how do we, in culture change, how do we change the way we show up to one another? One of the big surprises in all of this has been, I think that there's a lot of talk and conversation about death avoidance, and that we're a culture that's, scared of vulnerability, right? Or, stigmatizes, expressions of vulnerability. And I actually don't think any of that is true. I think that it's not that people don't want to talk about this, it's that they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so I think our, wish for the world is that we learn to be unafraid of each other's stories, right? And to know that you don't have to have lived and experienced, in all of its detail to be present for somebody who has. That what we can do is, witness and accompany one another. And you can do that with or without the help of a capitalized dinner party.
And I would just add, back to the money part, just to conclude it on a transactional place.
Let's do it.
We're in this beautiful moment where we're receiving applications from cities around the world. Many places there is a greater wait list than we can serve. Some of those places are the state of Texas, the nation of Canada, California. And we're looking to partner with people who have boots on the ground in those places, who can help us make strong, open-doored communities of the dinner party in some of these places where we're seeing more demand. Help on that front looks like a lot of different things, but we're wanting to connect with people who want to volunteer with us and help us fundraise and help us strengthen in some of these key places.
Thank you guys so much for your time.
Thanks for doing what you're doing.
It's a pleasure talking to you. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
If you want to get involved with the dinner party, maybe attending one or donating or volunteering, go to their website, thedinnerparty.org. And hey, even if you don't want to get involved, you should check out their website because it's amazing. Seriously, do it.
That was a really special conversation.
Yeah.
With Carla and Lennon. Do you have any final little takeaways or reflections after after spending 45 minutes with them and learning what they're up to?
I think one of the things that we didn't talk about a lot, but in reading their website, they make clear is that I once had someone say to me that if your life is simple, your relative maximum and your relative minimum is quite not very deep. So if you haven't had really hard things happen to you, you just don't have as much breadth and width to seeing how much there is in living and in life. So you can be standing on the top of the mountain, but the mountain actually looks kind of short. But if you go down into the valley, you can just see so much more of the real reality of living. And I think I haven't lost someone that was really close to me. I know people who have, and I've been through my own small forms of grief. And I think there is a lot of beauty and strength and sort of wisdom that comes from going through something like that and being able to truly see the width of human emotional experience, that I can tell that they understand amongst themselves, or Carla and Lennon, I think even understand between the two of them. And I think that's just something that separate of all the community conversations, I can see that, yes, there's sadness, but also there's some form of visibility of understanding the human experience that you end up walking away with. You know a little bit more about what it means to be alive, after going through something like that, if that makes sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What about you?
The cheers that Carla shared, I just remember one phrase was around who brought you to this table. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was just such a kind of poignant way to phrase this question around who did you lose that made you a member of this club that you never wanted to be a member of?
Yeah.
That idea of who brought you to this table, I thought was, and the stories that was, I don't think that was a question that they originally sort of posed in that way, and another host did. So I was just thinking about, how language can be flipped and remixed in this way to, once again, sort of come back to the purpose of why you're getting people together.
Yeah.
And some of that stuff, you won't know at the start, but other people, as they continue to make this thing their own, will figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. There are so many beautiful little touches to how they create the spaces that they make for everyone.
Yeah. Hey, y'all, thanks for listening today. You can find out more about us, People and Company, at our website, peopleand.company. Also, our book, Get Together, about building communities, is on Amazon. It's full of stories and learnings from conversations with community leaders like this one with Lennon and Carla. And yeah, please check it out.
Final thing, if you like the podcast, we'd love if you would either review us or subscribe to the podcast, because it helps get the podcast out to more people in the world. Cool?
Cool.
Till next time.
Later, y'all.
Yeah.